6 years. That's how long I've been living with this emptiness inside my chest. This hollow space where my husband's laughter used to echo through our home. 6 years since that rainy Tuesday evening when the police officer stood at my door, hat in his hands, delivering news that would shatter my world into pieces I'm still trying to put back together. My name is Anna. I'm 60 years old, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about grief. I thought I had mapped every corner of this pain, cataloged every memory, and learned to carry the weight of loss with something resembling grace. I was wrong. The house feels different in the evenings now. Not just quiet. I've grown accustomed to quiet, but somehow watchful, as if the walls themselves are holding secrets I'm not supposed to discover. My son Michael, now 28, comes to visit every Sunday, sitting at our kitchen table where his father used to read the newspaper and complain about politics. We talk about his job at the accounting firm, about the weather, about everything except the elephant in the room that seems to grow larger with each passing week. I've noticed changes in him lately. Small things that a mother's heart picks up on even when her mind tries to dismiss them as imagination. The way he checks his phone constantly during our conversations. The nervous energy that makes him fidget with his coffee cup. The careful way he phrases his questions about Dad, as if he's fishing for something specific. When I ask him about it, he just smiles that smile he's been giving me since he was 7 years old. The one that means he's hiding something but hopes I won't press him about it. Last Tuesday, I was doing what I do every Tuesday. Cleaning the house from top to bottom, the same ritual I've maintained since Robert died. It keeps my hands busy and my mind focused on something other than the silence that follows me from room to room. I was in Michael's old bedroom, the one he still uses when he stays overnight, dusting the furniture and changing the sheets he barely wrinkles when he sleeps there. That's when I heard it. A sound that stopped my heart and made the duster fall from my trembling fingers. A ringtone I hadn't heard in 6 years. A melody that used to make me smile when it played from Robert's phone during dinner, interrupting our conversations with work calls he always promised to ignore but never did. The opening notes of Moon River, the song we danced to at our wedding 32 years ago. But Robert's phone was destroyed in the accident. I saw it myself, cracked beyond repair, the screen dark and lifeless just like everything else that night. The police returned it to me along with his wallet and watch, the few tangible pieces of my husband that survived the impact. I kept the phone for months, unable to throw it away, checking it obsessively as if somehow it might ring one more time with his voice on the other end telling me this was all a terrible mistake. The sound was coming from somewhere in Michael's room. I stood frozen, listening to that familiar melody play once, twice, 3 times before it stopped, leaving me wondering if grief had finally driven me completely insane. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, drowning out everything else except the sudden, terrible certainty that something was very, very wrong. I began searching the room methodically, the way Robert taught me to approach problems when I was overwhelmed, one step at a time, one drawer at a time, one possibility at a time. Under the bed, nothing. In the nightstand, nothing but old magazines and charging cables. In the closet, behind the winter coats Michael hadn't worn since high school, I found a small cardboard box I'd never seen before. Inside the box was a phone. Not just any phone. Robert's phone, or one identical to it, complete with the same scratched case and the small crack in the corner where he'd dropped it on our kitchen floor 2 years before the accident. The screen was intact, glowing softly with notifications from numbers I didn't recognize and text messages that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Dad, I need to talk to you about Mom. She's getting suspicious. Can't meet this weekend. She's watching me too closely. When are you going to tell her the truth? This is killing me. The messages stretched back months. Dozens of conversations between my son and someone listed in the contacts as Dad. Someone who was supposed to be dead, buried in Riverside Cemetery under a headstone I visit every anniversary of his death, bringing fresh flowers and telling him about my day as if he might somehow hear me and respond. If you like emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers and it really helps our work. And comment which city you're watching from. I sat on Michael's bed, holding this impossible phone in my shaking hands, scrolling through conversations that reframed every interaction I'd had with my son over the past 6 months. Every nervous glance, every deflected question, every time he'd change the subject when I mentioned his father. My boy, my sweet boy who held my hand at the funeral and promised we'd get through this together, had been lying to me. The worst part wasn't the betrayal, though that cut deep enough to leave scars I knew would never fully heal. The worst part was the hope that bloomed in my chest like a poisonous flower, the desperate, irrational thought that maybe, just maybe, the police had been wrong. Maybe Robert hadn't died in that accident. Maybe he'd been in a coma, or suffered amnesia, or been taken to a hospital in another state where they couldn't identify him. Maybe this whole nightmare had been a mistake, and my husband was alive somewhere, trying to find his way back to us. But even as I entertained these fantasies, the logical part of my mind, the part that had been a nurse for 35 years and had seen enough tragedy to understand the difference between hope and delusion, knew better. I had identified Robert's body myself. I had held his cold hand and kissed his forehead goodbye. I had watched them lower his coffin into the ground and shoveled dirt onto the lid with my own hands. So who was my son talking to? Who was using my dead husband's name and phone number to manipulate my child? And why had Michael allowed himself to be drawn into this cruel charade? The phone buzzed in my hands, and a new message appeared on the screen. Michael, we need to meet tomorrow. There are things about your mother she needs to know. Things that happened before the accident. Things that will explain why she's been acting strange lately. My vision blurred with tears I refused to let fall. Acting strange? I'd been grieving my husband for 6 years, trying to rebuild a life that felt incomplete without him, working through my pain one day at a time while supporting my son through his own grief. If that was strange, then I didn't understand the word's meaning anymore. But there was something else in that message, something that made my nurse's instincts prickle with warning. The mention of "before the accident" suggested knowledge of our family that only someone close to us would possess. The tone was familiar, almost paternal, as if this person genuinely believed they had a right to discuss my behavior with my own son. I looked around Michael's room, the same room where he'd done homework and practiced guitar, and talked to me about his dreams of becoming an accountant like his father. The same room where I'd tucked him in after nightmares and celebrated his acceptance to college and helped him pack for his first apartment. Now it felt contaminated by secrets, transformed from a sanctuary of memories into a crime scene I was only beginning to understand. The house that had been my refuge for 6 years suddenly felt like a trap. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the evening light, every familiar object that had once brought comfort now seemed potentially sinister. If Michael could keep this secret from me, what else didn't I know about my own life? What other lies had I been living with, too trusting and too broken by grief to notice the deception happening right under my nose? I slipped the phone into my pocket and walked downstairs, moving through rooms that felt foreign despite being unchanged. In the kitchen, I made myself a cup of tea with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, and sat at the table where Robert used to read his morning paper. The silence that had been my companion for 6 years now felt oppressive, weighted with questions I was afraid to ask and answers I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. Tomorrow, Michael would come for his usual Sunday visit. Tomorrow, I would have to look into my son's eyes and pretend I didn't know about the phone, the messages, the elaborate lie that had been unfolding around me while I grieved in ignorance. Tomorrow, I would have to decide whether to confront him directly or play detective in my own family, gathering evidence against the child I'd raised and loved and trusted with my whole heart. But tonight, I would sit with this devastating knowledge and try to understand how the two most important people in my life, my husband and my son, had somehow conspired to make me feel like a stranger in my own existence. Tonight, I would begin the process of unraveling a mystery that threatened to destroy everything I thought I knew about love, family, and the man I'd mourned for 6 long years. The tea grew cold in my hands as darkness settled over the house, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Somewhere in this maze of deception was the truth, and I was determined to find it, no matter how much it might hurt to discover what my family had really been hiding from me all this time. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that used to make Robert comment about needing to winterize the house. I found myself standing at the kitchen window, watching for Michael's car while trying to rehearse conversations I wasn't sure I had the courage to have. The phone, that impossible, devastating phone, sat hidden in my bedroom drawer like a loaded weapon I wasn't sure how to use. When Michael's silver sedan pulled into the driveway at exactly 10:30, the same time he'd been arriving for the past 6 years, I felt my chest tighten with a combination of love and betrayal that made it hard to breathe. This was my son, the baby I'd nursed through fevers and the teenager I'd stayed up waiting for on prom night. This was also the man who'd been lying to me for months, carrying on secret conversations with someone pretending to be his dead father. "Morning, Mom," he said, kissing my cheek with the same automatic affection he'd shown since childhood. But now I noticed what I'd been too trusting to see before, the way his eyes didn't quite meet mine, the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he scanned the living room as if checking to make sure everything was exactly as he'd left it. "Coffee's ready," I said, my voice sounding normal, even though everything inside me felt like it was screaming. "I made your favorite blueberry muffins." We settled into our usual routine, him at his father's place at the table, me bustling around the kitchen in a performance of normalcy that felt increasingly surreal. But this time, I was watching him with different eyes. When his phone buzzed, his real phone, not the secret one hidden upstairs, I saw how quickly he checked it, how his face tightened almost imperceptibly before he turned it face down on the table. "Work?" I asked casually, refilling his coffee cup. "Just a client," he said. But his voice carried that same careful tone I'd been hearing for months without recognizing it for what it was. "You know how it is during tax season." It wasn't tax season. It was October. Michael had been doing this job for 5 years. I knew his schedule better than he thought I did. But I smiled and nodded, filing away another small lie in the growing collection I was accumulating. "How have you been feeling, Mom?" he asked. And there was something different in the question this time, an intensity that hadn't been there before, as if my answer carried weight beyond casual concern. "Fine," I said, though fine felt like the wrong word for someone whose world had been quietly crumbling around her for months without her knowledge. "Why do you ask? You just seem, I don't know, different lately. More anxious." "Dad always said you were the strongest person he knew, but even strong people have limits," Dad always said. Present tense, as if Robert's opinions were still being actively shared rather than remembered. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I processed this slip, this tiny crack in the careful facade my son had been maintaining. "Your father said a lot of things," I replied carefully, most of them 6 years ago. Michael's hand stilled around his coffee cup, and for a moment I saw something flash across his face. Guilt, maybe, or fear. "Of course. I just meant his memory, the things he used to say about you." But that wasn't what he'd meant, and we both knew it. The conversation continued around this new tension, both of us speaking carefully now, like diplomats negotiating a treaty neither of us wanted to sign. He asked about my health, my sleep, my mood, questions that felt less like concern and more like intelligence gathering. "Have you been having any strange thoughts lately?" he asked as we cleared the breakfast dishes, and the question was so pointed, so deliberate, that I nearly dropped the plate I was holding. "Strange thoughts?" I repeated, loading dishes into the dishwasher with movements that were perhaps a little too precise, a little too controlled. "You know, grief can do things to people's minds, make them see things that aren't there, hear things. The anniversary of Dad's death is coming up next month, and sometimes that triggers episodes. The word hung in the air between us like an accusation. My son, the child I'd raised to be honest and compassionate, was suggesting I was having some kind of mental breakdown, was preparing the groundwork to dismiss anything I might discover, or any questions I might ask as products of a grieving mind that couldn't distinguish reality from delusion. "I'm perfectly fine, Michael," I said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time all morning. My mind is as clear as it's ever been. Something shifted in his expression then, a flicker of what might have been disappointment. Had he been hoping I would confess to confusion? To seeing things that weren't there? Had he been building a case for my instability to justify whatever this deception was about? After he left that afternoon, promising to call during the week as he always did, I sat in the living room surrounded by the remnants of our carefully orchestrated visit. The coffee cup still warm on the side table, the Sunday paper folded exactly the way Robert used to leave it, the faint scent of Michael's cologne lingering in the air. Everything appeared normal, but I felt like I was looking at a stage set, a performance of family life that had been hiding something darker underneath. I retrieved the phone from my bedroom drawer and spent the evening reading through the messages again, looking for clues I might have missed. The conversation stretched back further than I'd initially realized, beginning shortly after the 5th anniversary of Robert's death. Someone had been patient, building this relationship with my son slowly, carefully, gaining his trust before introducing more complex elements of the deception. "Your mother has been through so much," read one message from early in the correspondence. "I worry about how she's handling things. Has she been acting strangely? She cries sometimes when she thinks I'm not looking," Michael had responded. "And she talks to your picture like you're still here." Reading my son's words about my private moments of grief felt like being stabbed with something sharp and cold. The tears I'd shed when I thought I was alone, the conversations I'd had with Robert's photograph when the silence became unbearable. Michael had been cataloging these moments of vulnerability and sharing them with a stranger who was using my husband's identity. But who was this person? The messages revealed someone with intimate knowledge of our family dynamics, someone who knew about Robert's habits, his relationship with Michael, even details about our marriage that only someone very close to us would understand. They knew about the argument Robert and I had the night before the accident, the one about money and his mother that we'd never resolved because there hadn't been time. They knew about Michael's childhood fear of thunderstorms, and how Robert used to read him astronomy books during bad weather. The more I read, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just some random scammer who'd gotten lucky with publicly available information. This was someone who had been part of our lives, someone who had observed us closely enough to mimic Robert's voice, his concerns, his way of relating to his son. Tuesday evening brought another revelation that made my blood run cold. I was reviewing the phone records I'd requested from the carrier, trying to trace the number that appeared in Michael's secret phone, when I discovered something that shattered what little remained of my sense of security. The number wasn't new. It wasn't some recently activated line that a criminal had chosen at random. According to the records, this number had been active and receiving calls for the past 6 years. The same 6 years Robert had been dead. Someone had been maintaining this phone line, paying the monthly bills, keeping Robert's digital presence alive long after his physical body had been buried. Someone had been planning this deception since shortly after the funeral, waiting for the right moment to make contact with my son. But the most disturbing discovery came when I cross-referenced the call logs with my own phone records. On dozens of occasions over the past 6 months, while I'd been at the grocery store or visiting my sister or working in the garden, calls had been made from this number to our house phone. Calls that would have gone to the answering machine. Messages that someone could have listened to and erased before I returned home. Had someone been monitoring my daily routine, learning my schedule, listening to my private voicemail messages? The thought made my skin crawl and sent me racing through the house to check every window lock, every door, every possible point of entry that might have been compromised. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the settling house made me jump. Every shadow cast by passing headlights sent my heart racing. The sanctuary that had protected me through 6 years of grief had been transformed into something that felt watched, violated, unsafe. Wednesday morning, I called my sister Janet for the first time in weeks. We'd grown apart since Robert's death, partly because she'd remarried and moved to the next town, but mostly because spending time with her happy second marriage made my own loss feel sharper, more permanent. "Anna, honey, you sound terrible," she said after I'd managed a few minutes of small talk. "What's going on?" I found myself wanting to tell her everything. About the phone, the messages, my growing suspicion that Michael was involved in something that went far deeper than a simple prank. But something held me back. A voice in my head that sounded suspiciously like my son asking about strange thoughts and episodes. "I've just been having trouble sleeping," I said instead. Anniversary season, you know. Oh, sweetie, have you talked to Michael about it? That boy worries about you so much. He called me last week asking if I thought you seemed, well, if you seemed like yourself lately. The phone nearly slipped from my hand. Michael had been talking to Janet about me, asking questions about my mental state, laying groundwork for what was beginning to look like a systematic campaign to make everyone in my life question my stability. What did you tell him? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I told him you were grieving, like any normal person would be. But Anna, if you're having problems, if you're seeing things or hearing things that aren't there, you need to get help. There's no shame in it. Grief can do terrible things to people's minds. There it was again, the suggestion that my mind was unreliable, that my perceptions couldn't be trusted. First from Michael, now from my own sister. How many people in my life had been primed to dismiss anything I might say as the ramblings of a woman who'd been broken by loss? After I hung up with Janet, I sat in my kitchen and faced a truth that made my chest ache with betrayal. I was alone in this. Whatever was happening, whoever was behind it, they'd been careful to isolate me, to plant seeds of doubt about my mental stability with the people who should have been my allies. But I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't imagining things. The phone was real, the messages were real, and somewhere in this maze of deception was an answer that would explain why someone wanted me to believe I was losing my mind. The next few days passed in a haze of careful observation and growing paranoia. I found myself jumping at every phone call, analyzing every conversation for hidden meanings, second-guessing interactions I'd had with Michael over the past months. Had I really been acting strangely, or was that just what he needed me to believe? Thursday afternoon, I decided to visit Robert's grave. I hadn't been there in over a month, and something drew me to that quiet hillside where so many of my questions had begun. The cemetery was nearly empty. Just a few maintenance workers and an elderly man placing flowers on a grave 3 rows over from Robert's headstone. I knelt in the grass that had grown over my husband's final resting place and tried to feel his presence the way I used to in those first raw months after the accident. But all I felt was confusion and a growing sense that even this sacred space had been contaminated by the deception surrounding me. I don't understand what's happening, I whispered to the granite marker that bore his name and dates. Someone is pretending to be you, talking to our son, making me feel like I'm losing my mind. I need you to help me figure this out. The wind rustled through the oak trees, but Robert didn't answer. He couldn't answer. Whatever was happening, I would have to solve it alone. On my way back to the car, I passed the cemetery office and made an impulsive decision. The clerk, a kind woman in her 40s with graying hair, looked up from her computer with a welcoming smile. "I'm Anna Morrison," I said, my hands trembling slightly as I approached her desk. "My husband is buried here. Robert Morrison, Section C, Plot 47. I was wondering, has anyone else been visiting his grave? Family members, maybe, or friends I might not know about?" The woman's expression shifted to something more cautious. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Morrison, but we don't typically share information about visitors unless there's been some kind of problem. Has something happened?" "I've been getting some strange phone calls," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Someone claiming to know my husband, asking questions about our family. I thought maybe they'd been coming here, trying to gather information." She consulted her computer, typing in what I assumed was Robert's information. After a few moments, she looked back at me with a frown. "According to our records, you haven't signed in to visit since August, but there have been other visitors logged under your husband's plot. Someone named Morrison has been coming regularly, usually on Wednesday afternoons." My heart stopped. "Morrison? What's their first name?" "Just Morrison. No first name listed. They always sign in right around closing time, when there's only one staff member on duty. I'm sorry, I can't be more specific." Someone had been visiting Robert's grave weekly, using our family name, timing their visits to avoid detection. Someone who knew enough about our family to feel entitled to claim that connection, to stand over my husband's body and, what? Pay respects? Gather information? Mock the grief of a widow who didn't even know she was being watched? That evening, I called Michael, hoping to keep the conversation casual while fishing for information. "How was your day, sweetheart?" I asked when he answered. "Fine, Mom. Busy at work. How are you feeling? You sounded a little off when we talked Sunday. There it was again. The gentle probing about my mental state, the careful attention to any signs of instability. I'm fine, I said. I went to visit your father's grave today. The silence on the other end stretched just a beat too long. That's nice, Mom. I know you find that comforting. When was the last time you went? Another pause. It's been a while. Work has been so crazy, and you know how I feel about, well, you know I'm not as good at that stuff as you are. Michael had always been uncomfortable with emotional displays, preferring to process his grief privately, but something in his voice suggested he was being deliberately evasive, as if my question had caught him off guard. Maybe we could go together sometime, I suggested. This weekend, perhaps? This weekend. His voice got slightly higher, the way it used to when he was a teenager trying to get out of family obligations. I'm not sure that's a good idea, Mom. You've been so emotional lately, and I worry that visiting the cemetery might trigger another episode. Another episode. As if I'd already had one. As if my grief was a mental illness that required management rather than a normal response to losing the most important person in my life. What episode? I asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. When have I had an episode? You know what I mean. The crying, the talking to Dad's picture, the way you've been suspicious of everyone lately. Janet mentioned you sounded paranoid when you called her. My sister had reported our conversation back to Michael. My own family was conspiring to paint me as unstable, building a case for my deteriorating mental health that would discredit anything I might discover or any accusations I might make. I'm not paranoid, I said, fighting to keep my voice level. I'm just trying to understand some things that don't make sense. What things? The question came too quickly, with too much intensity. Michael wanted to know what I suspected, what I'd figured out, how much danger his carefully constructed lie was in. Nothing specific, I lied. Just, I don't know, feelings. You know how mothers can be. Mom, I think you should talk to someone. A professional. Grief counseling, maybe. Or even just your doctor. This kind of paranoia and confusion isn't normal, even for someone who's been through what you've been through. Paranoia and confusion. My son was diagnosing me over the phone, dismissing my concerns as symptoms of a disorder that would explain away any inconvenient truths I might uncover. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and faced the devastating reality of my situation. The two people I trusted most in the world, my son and my sister, believed I was having some kind of breakdown. Any evidence I presented would be filtered through that assumption, dismissed as the delusions of a woman who couldn't handle her grief. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd read. The phone was real, the messages were real, and someone had been visiting Robert's grave under our family name. I wasn't crazy, but I was completely alone. Friday morning brought a knock at my door that made my blood run cold. Through the peephole, I saw a woman in her 30s with a clipboard and an official-looking badge hanging around her neck. Mrs. Morrison, I'm Sarah Chen from Adult Protective Services. We received a call expressing concern about your welfare. May I come in? Adult Protective Services. Someone had reported me as a vulnerable adult who couldn't care for herself. Someone had taken the whisper campaign about my mental state to its logical conclusion, involving authorities who had the power to declare me incompetent. Who called you? I asked through the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the locks. I'm not at liberty to say, but the caller was concerned about your mental health and your ability to live independently. They mentioned that you've been having episodes of confusion and paranoia. I opened the door because I had no choice, but every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to run. This woman had the power to have me committed, to take away my home, my independence, my right to make decisions about my own life. I'm perfectly fine, I said, as she stepped into my living room, her eyes already scanning for evidence of neglect or instability. I'm sure you are, she said with the practiced kindness of someone who'd heard desperate denials before. This is just a routine wellness check. Nothing to worry about. But her eyes were cataloging everything. The dust on the coffee table that I'd forgotten to wipe, the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter, the wilted flowers in a vase that I hadn't had the energy to replace. Normal signs of a person living alone, but in the context of a mental health evaluation, They became evidence of decline. Have you been taking care of yourself? Eating regularly? Taking any medications? Each question felt like a trap. If I admitted to having trouble sleeping or eating since discovering the phone, it would be recorded as evidence of instability. If I claimed everything was perfect, I would sound defensive and dishonest. I'm managing just fine, I said carefully. I've been a little tired lately, but that's normal for someone my age. She made notes on her clipboard. Your family mentioned that you've been having some unusual thoughts lately. Seeing things that might not be there? Hearing voices? My family. Michael and Janet had conspired to paint me as delusional, setting up this intervention to neutralize any threat I might pose to their carefully orchestrated deception. I haven't been seeing or hearing anything unusual, I said, each word measured and deliberate. What about this belief that your deceased husband is somehow still alive, that he's been communicating with family members? The blood drained from my face. She knew about the phone. Somehow, someone had told her about my discovery, but they'd presented it as a delusion rather than evidence of fraud. I never said my husband was alive, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But you have been concerned about phone calls and messages, haven't you? Communications that you believe are coming from him? They'd twisted everything. The real evidence I'd found had been reframed as symptoms of a breakdown. My logical concerns dismissed as the fantasies of a grieving mind that couldn't accept reality. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, each question designed to trap me into admitting to behaviors that could be interpreted as signs of mental illness. By the time Sarah Chen left, I felt like I'd been stripped naked and examined under a microscope. My every word and gesture scrutinized for evidence of instability. I'll be filing my report with the court, she said as she gathered her things. For now, you're free to continue living independently, but we'll be checking in periodically to monitor your progress. Monitor my progress. As if recovery from a delusion I'd never had was something that could be measured and evaluated. After she left, I collapsed onto my couch and finally allowed myself to cry. Not the gentle tears of grief I'd been shedding for 6 years, but the desperate sobs of someone who'd discovered that the people she loved most were actively working to destroy her credibility and her freedom. They were winning. Whoever was behind this elaborate deception had successfully isolated me, discredited me, and turned my own family against me. I was trapped in a maze of lies with no way out, and no one who would believe the truth even if I could prove it. But as I sat there in my living room, surrounded by the remnants of a life I'd thought was real, something shifted inside me. The despair that had been consuming me for days began to crystallize into something harder, more determined. I might be alone, but I wasn't defeated. Not yet. The weekend that followed the visit from Adult Protective Services felt like living underwater. Everything moved slowly, sounds became muffled, and even the simplest tasks required tremendous effort. I found myself sitting in Robert's chair for hours, staring at the television without seeing what was on the screen, trying to process the magnitude of what had been done to me. My own son had reported me to authorities as mentally incompetent. My sister had provided corroborating testimony about my deteriorating condition. Together, they'd built a case that painted my discovery of real evidence as the delusions of a woman who couldn't accept her husband's death. I stopped answering the phone. When Michael called, I let it go to voicemail, listening later to his concerned messages about my state of mind and his gentle suggestions that I should get help. When Janet called, worried about my silence, I deleted her messages without listening to them completely. Even the mailman's friendly wave made me wonder if he'd been instructed to watch for signs of my decline. The house that had been my sanctuary became my prison. Every room held memories that now felt contaminated by doubt. Had Robert really been as loving as I remembered? Or had there been secrets I'd been too naive to see? Had our marriage been the partnership I'd treasured? Or had I been living a lie even before his death? I found myself questioning everything, every happy memory, every moment of closeness, every time he'd told me he loved me. If someone could orchestrate this elaborate deception using his identity, what did that say about the man I'd mourned for 6 years? What kind of husband leaves behind the tools for someone to torment his widow? Tuesday evening, I was sitting in the kitchen picking at a dinner I had no appetite for when I heard a sound that made my blood freeze. The garage door was opening, slowly, mechanically, as if someone was using the remote control from outside. But I was the only one with a garage door opener. Michael had returned his years ago when he moved out, and Robert's had been destroyed in the accident along with everything else in his car. I grabbed the kitchen phone and crept toward the window that looked out over the driveway, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The garage was indeed open, its dark interior yawning like a mouth, but I couldn't see anyone or any vehicle. Minutes passed. 5, then 10, then 15. Nothing moved, no one appeared, but the garage remained open. An invitation or a threat I couldn't interpret. Finally, I forced myself to walk through the house to the door that connected to the garage. My hands shook as I reached for the light switch, terrified of what I might find but unable to bear the uncertainty any longer. The garage was empty except for my car and the usual collection of gardening tools and storage boxes. But on the concrete floor, directly in front of where Robert used to park his truck, someone had placed a single white rose. Not dropped it, not thrown it. Placed it carefully, deliberately, as if it were an offering on an altar. The stem was fresh, the petals perfect, the kind of expensive flower that came from a real florist rather than a grocery store display. I stood in that doorway for a long time, staring at that rose and trying to understand what message it was supposed to convey. Remembrance? Threat? Mockery of my grief? The flower was beautiful and somehow obscene at the same time, a violation of the space where Robert had parked his truck every evening for 15 years. When I finally worked up the courage to pick it up, I found a small card tucked beneath it. In handwriting I didn't recognize, someone had written, "Some secrets are worth keeping. Others will destroy everything you think you know." I called the police, but by the time the officer arrived 40 minutes later, I knew how the conversation would go. The young patrolman was polite but clearly skeptical, taking notes about the opened garage and the mysterious flower with the weary patience of someone who'd dealt with paranoid elderly residents before. "Any idea how someone might have gotten a garage door opener?" he asked, examining the device clipped to my car's visor. "No one else should have one," I said. "My son returned his when he moved out, and my husband's was destroyed in a car accident 6 years ago. Could someone have made a copy? Maybe someone who had access to your house while you were away?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Someone had been in my house. Someone had been watching my routines, learning my schedule, making copies of my garage door opener. The place I'd felt safest had been compromised for who knew how long. "I'll file a report," the officer said, handing me a business card. "But honestly, Mrs. Morrison, this could be anything. Kids playing pranks, someone who got the wrong address, even an old boyfriend of your son's who still had access. Without evidence of forced entry or actual theft, there's not much we can investigate." After he left, I spent the night checking and rechecking every lock, every window, every possible point of entry. But I knew it was futile. If someone had been able to come and go at will, copying my garage door opener and leaving flowers like some twisted secret admirer, then no lock would keep them out if they truly wanted in. The next morning brought another blow that left me reeling. I was checking my email for the first time in days when I found a message from my bank's fraud department. Someone had attempted to access my accounts online using my social security number and mother's maiden name. The attempt had been unsuccessful because I'd never set up online banking, but the fact that someone had my most sensitive personal information sent me into a panic that made it hard to breathe. I called the bank immediately, demanding to know how someone could have gotten access to information that I'd never shared with anyone except your family members, the customer service representative said gently. "Often these cases involve relatives who have access to personal documents. Has anyone in your family been acting strangely lately? Anyone who might be experiencing financial difficulties?" Michael, my son who handled my taxes, who had copies of my important documents in case of emergency, who knew every detail of my financial life because I'd trusted him completely. "What would someone be able to do if they'd gotten into my accounts?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Well, they could transfer money, change beneficiaries, even take out loans using your accounts as collateral. We see it all the time with elderly customers. Family members who think they're entitled to inheritance money before their relatives pass away. Elderly customers. I was 60 years old, not ancient. But to this young woman on the phone, I was apparently at the age where financial abuse by family members became statistically likely. That afternoon, I drove to the bank and demanded to see every account statement for the past 6 months. What I discovered made me sick to my stomach. Small transfers I'd never authorized, mysterious fees I'd never incurred, account access from IP addresses I'd never used. Someone had been slowly, carefully draining my accounts for months. The pattern was sophisticated and deliberate. Amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts, scheduled to coincide with times when I was likely to be distracted or emotional. Around the anniversary of Robert's death, during holidays when grief hit hardest, immediately after family visits when I was most likely to be vulnerable. How much? I asked the bank manager, a middle-aged woman who'd been reviewing my files with increasing concern. In total? Almost $14,000 over the past 8 months. $14,000. My emergency fund, the money I'd been saving for home repairs and medical expenses, the financial security that had allowed me to sleep at night, knowing I could handle whatever life threw at me. The transfers all went to the same account, she continued. It's listed under the name Robert Morrison, but with a different social security number than the one we have on file for your late husband. Someone had opened a bank account using Robert's name. Someone had been systematically stealing from me while I grieved, using my dead husband's identity to rob his widow. I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. Every assumption I'd made about my life, every person I'd trusted, every memory I'd treasured had been revealed as potentially compromised. I was living in a house of mirrors where nothing was real, and everyone I loved was a stranger wearing a familiar face. That evening, I sat on my living room floor surrounded by 6 years of financial documents, phone records, and family photographs, trying to piece together when this nightmare had begun. The evidence painted a picture of careful, long-term planning that had started shortly after Robert's funeral. Someone had been watching me grieve, studying my vulnerabilities, learning my routines. They'd recruited my son, manipulated my sister, and built a case for my mental instability that would discredit anything I discovered. They'd stolen my money, invaded my home, and turned my own family against me. But as I sat there in that chaos of papers and memories, sorting through the wreckage of my life, I realized something that made my pulse quicken with the first hope I'd felt in days. They'd been very thorough, very careful, very clever, but they'd made one mistake. In all their planning, in all their manipulation, in all their systematic destruction of my credibility and security, they'd overlooked something I'd kept hidden even from Michael, even from the bank, even from the lawyers who'd handled Robert's estate, something that could prove everything I'd discovered was real. I looked up at the ceiling where Robert's old briefcase sat in the attic, untouched since the day I'd packed away his belongings. Inside that briefcase was documentation they didn't know existed, evidence they couldn't discredit or explain away. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. They thought they'd thought of everything. They thought they'd accounted for every possibility, planned for every contingency. But I still had something they didn't know about, something that was going to change everything. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The despair that had been drowning me for weeks had crystallized overnight into something harder, more focused. I was done being a victim. I was done allowing other people to define my reality. It was time to remember who I had been before grief made me forget my own strength. I climbed into the attic for the first time since Robert's death, my knees protesting as I navigated the narrow ladder and dusty floorboards. The briefcase sat exactly where I'd left it 6 years ago, covered in a thin layer of dust but otherwise untouched. Inside were documents that even Michael didn't know existed, papers Robert had kept separate from our regular files, things he'd handled personally without involving our usual accountant or lawyer. What I found made my hands shake, but not with fear this time, with rage. Insurance policies I'd never seen before, investment accounts opened in Robert's name alone, and most damning of all, correspondence with a private investigator dated just 3 months before Robert's accident. Someone had been investigating our family's finances, our daily routines, our personal relationships. Someone had been gathering intelligence about us while we lived our ordinary lives, completely unaware that we were being studied like specimens under a microscope. The investigators' reports were detailed and invasive. Photographs of me leaving for work, times when Michael visited, observations about our neighbors and their schedules, even notes about Robert's mother, his brother Thomas, and other family members I rarely saw anymore. Someone had been building a comprehensive picture of our lives, learning our vulnerabilities, identifying the people who might be useful in some future scheme. But the most shocking discovery was a life insurance policy Robert had taken out secretly, worth $500,000, with a beneficiary I'd never heard of. Elena Morrison. Not me, not Michael, not anyone from Robert's known family. A woman whose name appeared nowhere else in any of our documents, but who was apparently entitled to a fortune if Robert died. I photographed every page with my phone, my hands steady now despite the magnitude of what I was uncovering. These weren't random documents. They were pieces of a puzzle that had been 6 years in the making, evidence of a conspiracy that had begun long before Robert's death. By the time I climbed back down from the attic, I understood something that made my blood run cold. Robert's accident hadn't been an accident at all, but I also understood something else. Whoever had orchestrated this elaborate scheme had made a critical error. They'd assumed that a grieving widow would never think to look beyond the obvious, that I would accept the sanitized version of my husband's life that had been presented to me by lawyers and insurance companies. They'd counted on my grief to keep me passive, my trust to keep me ignorant. They'd miscalculated badly. I spent the rest of the day researching Elena Morrison, using every search engine and social media platform I could access. What I found painted a picture that made perfect sense of everything that had happened since Robert's death. Elena Morrison was Robert's half-sister, the daughter of his father's first marriage. She was 15 years older than Robert, had been cut off from the family before I ever met my husband, and had apparently spent decades nursing resentments about inheritance money she felt she'd been cheated out of. According to public records, she'd been married 3 times, divorced twice, and had filed bankruptcy on multiple occasions. More importantly, she had a son named David who was exactly Michael's age. A son who, according to his social media profiles, worked in telecommunications and had certifications in digital forensics and electronic surveillance. The family connection explained how someone could know so many intimate details about our lives. Elena would have heard stories about Robert's childhood, his habits, his relationship with Michael. She would know enough about our family dynamics to impersonate him convincingly, to manipulate Michael with exactly the right emotional pressure points. And her son David would have the technical skills to clone phones, hack accounts, and monitor communications without leaving obvious traces. But knowing who was behind the deception and proving it were 2 different things. I needed evidence that would convince authorities who had already been primed to see me as mentally unstable. I needed documentation that couldn't be dismissed as the delusions of a grieving widow. That evening, instead of my usual routine of watching television until I fell asleep in Robert's chair, I began planning. I made lists of everyone who had been involved in discrediting me, everyone who had access to information they shouldn't have possessed, everyone who might be complicit in what was beginning to look like an elaborate murder plot disguised as a family squabble. I also began changing my routines in subtle ways. Instead of grocery shopping on Tuesdays, I went on Fridays. Instead of visiting the bank on the same day each week, I varied my schedule unpredictably. I started parking in different spots, taking different routes home, making it harder for anyone who might be watching to predict my movements. Most importantly, I stopped talking to Michael about anything meaningful. When he called, I kept our conversations brief and superficial, discussing the weather and neighborhood gossip instead of my emotional state or any concerns I might have. I needed him to believe I was exactly what he and Elena wanted me to be, a broken, confused woman who posed no threat to their carefully orchestrated plan. "You sound better, Mom," he said during one of these carefully neutral conversations. "More like yourself." "I've been thinking about what you said," I replied, injecting just the right note of uncertainty into my voice. "About maybe talking to someone, a professional." "That's wonderful," he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. "I think that would really help you process Dad's death in a healthier way." process Dad's death, as if my discovery of evidence that he'd been murdered was just another stage of grief to be medicated and managed. I've been having trouble sleeping, I continued, playing the role of the mentally fragile widow they needed me to be. Sometimes I think I hear things at night, sounds that don't make sense. What kind of sounds? There was something sharp in his question, an alertness that confirmed my suspicions. Michael wasn't just a victim of Elena's manipulation. He was an active participant, gathering intelligence about how much I knew and how much danger I posed to their scheme. "Oh, probably nothing," I said with a little laugh that I hoped sounded self-deprecating. "Probably just the house settling. You know how old houses can be?" "But probably," he agreed. But I could hear him relaxing slightly. "Have you been taking those sleeping pills Dr. Martinez prescribed?" I'd never been prescribed sleeping pills by Dr. Martinez or anyone else, but Michael seemed to know about medication I'd never taken, which meant someone had been planning to drug me if necessary. Another piece of evidence that this conspiracy went far deeper than I'd initially realized. "Not regularly," I said. "I don't like the way they make me feel in the morning. Maybe you should take them more consistently. Sometimes disrupted sleep can cause confusion and paranoia." Confusion and paranoia. The same words Adult Protective Services had used. The same diagnosis that everyone seemed eager to attach to any behavior that threatened their narrative. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and faced the terrifying reality of my situation. My son wasn't just lying to me. He was actively working to gaslight me, to make me doubt my own perceptions, to convince me that the evidence I'd discovered was just another symptom of my declining mental health. But I also felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Control. For the first time since finding that hidden phone, I was the one with superior information. I knew who Elena Morrison was. I knew about David's technical expertise. And I knew about the insurance policy that provided 500,000 motives for murder. More importantly, I knew they thought I was broken, confused, and harmless. They believed their psychological warfare had succeeded, that I was too damaged and discredited to pose any real threat to their plans. They were about to learn how wrong they were. I pulled out a notebook and began writing down everything I knew, everything I suspected, and everything I could prove. The list was longer than I'd expected, but it was also more coherent than I'd dared to hope. The evidence formed a pattern that even the most skeptical investigator would have to take seriously, but I needed more than documentation. I needed witnesses, allies, people who could corroborate my story and help me present evidence in a way that couldn't be dismissed as the fantasies of an unstable woman. That's when I remembered something Elena and David couldn't possibly know about, something that would give me an advantage they'd never see coming. Mrs. Patterson, my neighbor across the street, was the kind of woman who noticed everything that happened in our neighborhood. She was retired, widowed herself, and spent most of her time sitting by her front window doing crossword puzzles and watching the world go by. Robert used to joke that she was better than any security system because nothing happened on our block without her knowledge. If someone had been watching my house, monitoring my routine, or visiting when I wasn't home, Mrs. Patterson would have seen them. And unlike my son and sister, she had no reason to doubt my mental stability or dismiss my concerns as delusions. The next morning, I baked a loaf of banana bread and walked across the street to pay a visit I should have made months ago. It was time to find out exactly what Mrs. Patterson had been observing while I'd been too lost in grief to notice I was being hunted. It was time to start building the case that would bring down the people who thought they'd destroyed me. For the first time in weeks, I felt something that had been missing from my life for too long. I felt dangerous. Mrs. Patterson answered her door with the kind of surprised delight that told me I'd been a terrible neighbor for far too long. At 73, she moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to navigate the world despite arthritis and failing eyesight, but her mind was as sharp as ever. "Anna, dear, what a lovely surprise. Come in, come in. I was just making tea." Her living room was exactly what I'd expected. Immaculately clean, filled with photographs of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, dominated by a large window that provided an unobstructed view of our entire street. This was where she spent her days, and from this vantage point, she would have seen everything. "I brought banana bread," I said, settling into the chair she indicated. I realized I've been such a poor neighbor since Robert died. I wanted to apologize for being so absent. Oh, honey, grief makes us all do strange things. Don't you worry about that for even a moment. She poured tea from a delicate china service that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I've been worried about you, though. There's been a lot of unusual activity around your house lately. My heart quickened, but I kept my voice casual. Unusual how? Well, for one thing, that nephew of yours has been coming by quite regularly when you're not home. At least I assume he's a nephew. Young man, maybe 40, drives a dark blue sedan. He has a key to your garage. David. Elena's son had been coming to my house, using a copied garage door opener to enter when I was away. Mrs. Patterson had been watching him violate my home for months, probably assuming he was family I'd given permission to visit. I'm not sure I know who you mean, I said carefully. What does he look like? Tall, thin, dark hair. Always carries a briefcase or some kind of equipment bag. Very professional looking. He usually stays about an hour, sometimes longer. I assumed he was helping you with something technical. You know how these young people are with computers and such. Technical equipment. David had been inside my house regularly, probably installing surveillance devices, copying files, maybe even searching for documents like the ones I'd found in Robert's briefcase. The violation felt personal and invasive in ways that made my skin crawl. When was the last time you saw him? Oh, just yesterday afternoon. He seemed to be in more of a hurry than usual, though. Usually he's very methodical, but yesterday he kept looking around like he was worried someone might see him. Yesterday. The day after I'd discovered the evidence in the attic. Somehow, they'd known I was getting closer to the truth, and David had come to clean up whatever traces he'd left behind. Mrs. Patterson, I said, leaning forward slightly, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully. That man isn't my nephew. I've never given anyone permission to enter my house when I'm not home. Her teacup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. Oh my goodness. You mean he's been breaking in? Something like that. It's complicated, but I think someone has been watching me, monitoring my activities. Maybe even planning to hurt me. I could see her processing this information, her mind working through months of observations with this new context. There have been other things too, she said slowly. Phone calls to your house when you're not home. I can see the answering machine light blinking through your kitchen window. And sometimes I've seen someone sitting in a car down the block, just watching your house. Can you describe the car? Different cars, actually. A silver SUV, a black pickup truck, even a white van on a few occasions. Never the same vehicle twice, but always someone sitting inside for hours at a time. Professional surveillance. They'd been watching me far more carefully than I'd realized, rotating vehicles to avoid detection, timing their observations to learn my patterns and vulnerabilities. Mrs. Patterson, I need your help. I think these people have been planning something for a very long time, and I'm afraid they might try to have me committed or declared incompetent. If that happens, I need someone who knows the truth about what's been going on. She reached across the small space between our chairs and took my hand. Her fingers were thin and cold, but her grip was surprisingly strong. Tell me everything, dear. Everything you know. For the next 2 hours, I laid out the entire story. The hidden phone, the messages from Robert, Michael's betrayal, the financial fraud, the insurance policy, and my discovery of Elena Morrison's identity. Mrs. Patterson listened without interruption, asking only occasional clarifying questions that proved she was following every detail. When I finished, she sat quietly for several minutes, staring out her window at my house across the street. I believe you, she said finally, and I think you're in more danger than you realize. People who go to this much trouble, who plan this carefully, they're not going to just give up because you've discovered them. What do you think I should do? Document everything. Get copies of all the evidence you found. Store them somewhere safe, somewhere they can't get to them. And we need to set up a system so I can keep track of your safety. Mrs. Patterson, despite her age and physical limitations, had a mind that worked like a detective's. She helped me plan a communication system, specific times when I would call her each day, code words I could use if I was in danger, signals I could give from my windows if I needed help. "There's something else," she said as I prepared to leave. "That young man with the equipment? He's been very interested in your mail. I've seen him going through your mailbox several times, photographing envelopes before putting them back." Mail theft explained how they'd gotten access to my personal information, how they'd known about bank statements and insurance documents. David had been intercepting my correspondence for months, copying everything before I ever saw it. "One more thing, Anna. Have you noticed your landline phone acting strangely? Echoing? Or sounds like someone else might be listening?" I had noticed that, actually. Subtle changes in the phone's behavior that I'd attributed to the aging equipment, but now I realized they'd probably tapped my home phone, listening to every conversation, monitoring every call. When I returned home that afternoon, I looked at my house with new eyes. It wasn't my sanctuary anymore. It was a compromised location where every conversation could be overheard and every movement monitored, but it was also the place where I would make my stand. I spent the evening creating copies of all the evidence I'd found, storing them in multiple locations. Some at Mrs. Patterson's house, some in a safety deposit box I opened at a different bank, some uploaded to secure cloud storage accounts the conspirators didn't know existed. But the most important thing I did was write a detailed letter explaining everything I'd discovered, sealed it in an envelope addressed to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and gave it to Mrs. Patterson with strict instructions to mail it if anything happened to me. If I disappear, if I'm committed to a psychiatric facility, if I die under suspicious circumstances, mail this letter immediately, I told her. Don't trust anyone who tries to convince you I was mentally ill or that my concerns weren't real. That night, I called Michael for what I knew would be one of our last normal conversations. "How are you feeling, Mom?" he asked, and I could hear the practiced concern in his voice. "Better," I said, injecting a note of fragile hope into my tone. "I've been thinking about what you said about getting help. I made an appointment with a therapist for next week." "That's wonderful. I'm proud of you for taking that step. I also wanted to ask you something. Do you remember your father ever mentioning anyone named Elena? Maybe someone from his family I didn't know about." The silence on the other end stretched just a beat too long. "Elena? No, I don't think so. Why?" "I found some old papers of his and that name was mentioned. I was just curious. Probably just someone from work, or maybe a client. Dad dealt with a lot of people." But his voice had changed, developed a tension that hadn't been there moments before. Michael knew exactly who Elena Morrison was, and my casual question had just told him that I was closer to the truth than they'd realized. "Well, it's probably nothing," I said with a little laugh. "You know how I've been lately, seeing mysteries where there probably aren't any." "Probably," he agreed, but I could tell he was no longer really listening to me. He was already planning his next move, probably composing a text message to Elena or David, warning them that I was asking dangerous questions. After I hung up, I sat in my living room and felt the weight of what was coming. They knew I was suspicious now. They knew their carefully constructed web of lies was beginning to unravel, which meant they would have to accelerate their timeline, move more aggressively to neutralize the threat I posed. But I was ready for them. I had allies they didn't know about, evidence they couldn't destroy, and plans they couldn't anticipate. Most importantly, I was no longer the broken, trusting woman they'd been manipulating for months. I was someone they'd created through their own cruelty, someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new attempts to discredit or silence me. But tonight, for the first time in 6 years, I felt like myself again. I felt like the woman Robert had fallen in love with, strong, intelligent, and absolutely unwilling to be anyone's victim. The confrontation came sooner than I expected, but exactly as I'd prepared for. Thursday morning, I was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing the evidence I'd compiled when I heard multiple cars pulling into my driveway. Through the window, I saw Michael's sedan, followed by a white van I didn't recognize, and finally a silver SUV that Mrs. Patterson had described seeing in surveillance of my house. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained steady as I activated the small recording device I'd purchased and hidden in my shirt pocket. Whatever was about to happen, there would be a record of it. Michael entered using his key, followed by a woman in her 70s with steel gray hair and cold blue eyes that looked exactly like Robert's. Elena Morrison in the flesh, finally dropping her pretense of hiding in the shadows. Behind her came a younger man carrying what looked like medical equipment. David, no doubt, though he was accompanied by someone in scrubs who was clearly a nurse or medical technician. "Hello, Anna," Elena said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling situations. "I'm Elena Morrison, Robert's sister. I think it's time we had a conversation." "Half-sister," I corrected quietly, not standing from my chair. "And you're supposed to be dead. According to the family stories Robert told me, you died in a car accident 20 years ago." Elena's smile was sharp and humorless. Robert always did have a flair for dramatic simplification. "I've been very much alive, just estranged from the family, but recent circumstances have made it necessary for me to take a more active role in family affairs. Recent circumstances like your son stealing my money and pretending to be my dead husband." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Michael shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet my eyes, while David's expression remained carefully neutral. "You've been under tremendous stress, Anna," Elena continued, settling into Robert's chair without invitation. "Grief can do terrible things to people's minds. It can make them see conspiracies where none exist. Imagine elaborate plots that are really just the normal complications of family life." "Normal complications," I repeated. "Is that what you call murder?" The word hung in the air like a gunshot. Elena's composure flickered for just a moment, revealing something predatory underneath the grandmotherly facade. "That's a very serious accusation," she said carefully. "The kind of accusation that someone might make if they were suffering from paranoid delusions brought on by unresolved grief. The kind of accusation someone might make if they'd found evidence that their husband's death wasn't accidental." I reached into my purse and pulled out copies of the documents I'd discovered in Robert's briefcase. Evidence like a private investigator's report documenting surveillance of our family. Evidence like a life insurance policy with you as the beneficiary. Evidence like financial records showing systematic theft from my accounts. Elena's eyes went to the papers in my hands, and I saw calculation replace sympathy in her expression. She was trying to determine how much I actually knew versus how much I was guessing. "Those documents could have been forged," David said, speaking for the first time. His voice was younger than Robert's, but the inflection was eerily similar. "Grief-stricken people sometimes create elaborate fantasies to avoid accepting reality." "Could have been forged by someone with your technical skills, you mean?" I looked directly at him. "Someone who specializes in digital forensics and electronic surveillance? Someone who's been entering my house regularly, monitoring my phone calls and stealing my mail?" Michael finally found his voice. "Mom, you're scaring me. This paranoia, these wild accusations, this isn't like you." "You're right," I said, standing up slowly. "The old me would have trusted you completely. The old me would have believed that my son could never lie to me, steal from me, or conspire with strangers to have me declared mentally incompetent. But the old me didn't know that my husband had been murdered." "Robert died in a car accident," Elena said firmly. "There was a police investigation, an autopsy, insurance claims. Everything was thoroughly documented. Everything was thoroughly orchestrated," I corrected. "By someone who had been planning it for months, someone who knew Robert's routines, someone who had access to his vehicle, someone who knew exactly how to make murder look like an accident." I walked to the kitchen counter and picked up my landline phone. "This phone has been tapped for months. Every conversation I've had, every call I've made, you've been listening. David, show them the equipment you installed." David's face had gone pale, but he remained silent. "And this," I continued, pulling the hidden phone from my purse, "is the device you've been using to impersonate my dead husband. The phone with 6 years of payment history, maintained specifically for this elaborate gaslighting campaign." Elena was no longer bothering to look sympathetic. "Even if any of that were true, which it isn't, who would believe the word of a mentally unstable woman against respected members of the community? Mrs. Patterson would believe me," I said. "She's been documenting your surveillance activities for months. She has photographs, times, dates, vehicle descriptions. She's been watching your son enter my house illegally and monitoring the suspicious cars that have been staking out my neighborhood." For the first time, Elena looked genuinely surprised. They'd been so focused on isolating me from my immediate family that they'd overlooked the possibility of other witnesses. Mrs. Patterson is an elderly woman with failing eyesight, David said quickly. Her testimony wouldn't hold up in court. Maybe not by itself, I agreed. But combined with the evidence I've already provided to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, it paints a very compelling picture. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena and David exchanged glances that confirmed everything I'd suspected about their relationship and their level of involvement in this conspiracy. You're bluffing, Elena said finally. You haven't contacted the FBI. 3 days ago, I said calmly. Copies of all the evidence, detailed timeline of the fraud, documented proof of the surveillance and harassment. Agent Sarah Chen, interesting coincidence with the name, don't you think, is expecting my call this afternoon to discuss the next steps in the investigation. I hadn't actually contacted the FBI yet, but the lie was worth it to see Elena's carefully controlled mask finally slip completely. You stupid woman, she snarled, dropping all pretense of concern. Do you have any idea how much money is at stake here? Robert stole my inheritance, cut me out of everything that should have been mine. I spent 20 years planning this, waiting for the right moment. So you killed him. He was supposed to die in that accident and leave you with enough insurance money to live comfortably while I collected what was rightfully mine. But then you started asking questions, getting suspicious. You forced us to take more aggressive measures. Michael made a sound like a wounded animal. Elena, you said he died in an accident. You said we were just helping Mom deal with her grief. Your mother was supposed to have a nice quiet breakdown that would leave me in control of Robert's remaining assets, Elena continued, no longer caring who heard her confession. But she turned out to be more resilient than expected, which is why we're here now, to finish what should have been finished years ago. The medical technician stepped forward with a syringe, and I realized their plan had evolved beyond simple gaslighting. They intended to drug me, probably with something that would either kill me or leave me permanently incapacitated. Michael, I said, looking directly at my son, are you going to let them murder your mother? Michael's face crumpled. I thought, Elena said Dad was alive, that he'd been in a coma, that he was getting better. She showed me medical records, told me you were having a breakdown because you couldn't handle hope. I thought we were protecting you. Even now, even with Elena's confession hanging in the air between us, my son had been so thoroughly manipulated that he still believed parts of the lie. Your father is dead, Michael. He's been dead for 6 years, and these people killed him. The sound of sirens in the distance made everyone in the room freeze. Mrs. Patterson, bless her, had been watching through her window and had called for help the moment she saw the suspicious vehicles in my driveway. Elena lunged for the papers in my hands, but I was ready for her. 6 years of grief had made me stronger than she'd anticipated, and I held on while she clawed at the evidence of her crimes. It's over, Elena, I said as police officers appeared in my doorway. Everything you've done, every lie you've told, every crime you've committed, it's all documented. Robert is going to get the justice he deserved, and you're going to pay for what you've done to our family. As the handcuffs clicked around Elena's wrists, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the day Robert died. Peace. Not just the relief of survival, but the deep satisfaction of truth finally being recognized, of justice finally being served. Michael was crying, the full weight of his manipulation finally clear to him. David was demanding a lawyer. Elena was screaming about conspiracies and false evidence. But I was calm. For the first time in 6 years, I was completely, utterly calm. The truth had set me free. 6 months later, I stood in the same courthouse where Elena Morrison had been sentenced to 25 years for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, and elder abuse. David received 15 years for his role in the technical aspects of the conspiracy. The judge had been particularly harsh in his sentencing, noting that the systematic psychological torture they'd inflicted was as cruel as any physical violence. Today wasn't about their punishment, though. Today was about reclaiming what they'd stolen from me. The insurance company had finally released the $500,000 policy that Elena had fraudulently claimed, plus penalties and interest that brought the total to nearly $700,000. More importantly, They'd issued a formal apology for the investigative failures that had allowed the fraud to continue for so long. My bank had reversed all the unauthorized transfers and paid additional damages for their failure to protect my accounts. The FBI had recovered most of the money Elena and David had stolen, funds that were now being returned to me with interest. But the money, significant as it was, wasn't the real victory. The real victory was standing here as a woman whose truth had been validated, whose sanity had been vindicated, whose fight for justice had succeeded against impossible odds. Michael waited for me outside the courthouse, his face still bearing the weight of guilt and shame that had marked him since that terrible day when Elena's true nature had been revealed. The past 6 months had been difficult for both of us, working through the damage that manipulation and lies had done to our relationship. "How do you feel?" he asked, as we walked toward the parking garage. "Free," I said, and meant it completely. For the first time in 6 years, I feel free. He'd been in therapy since Elena's arrest, working with a specialist in cult deprogramming to understand how thoroughly he'd been psychologically manipulated. The techniques Elena had used, isolation, gaslighting, manufactured crises, carefully constructed lies mixed with enough truth to seem credible, were the same ones used by professional manipulators and abusive partners. "I keep thinking about all the times I dismissed your concerns," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "All the times I suggested you were losing your mind when you were actually getting closer to the truth. You were a victim, too," I reminded him, something I'd had to say many times over the past months. "Elena spent years preparing to manipulate you. She studied our family, learned your vulnerabilities, crafted a story designed specifically to exploit your love for your father and your concern for me. It was true, but it had taken time for both of us to accept it." Michael's guilt over his role in the conspiracy had been almost as destructive as the conspiracy itself. He'd wanted to punish himself, to take responsibility for crimes that had been committed against him as much as by him. The therapy had helped him understand that recognizing his victimization wasn't the same as excusing his actions. He'd still participated in activities that hurt me, still dismissed my concerns and questioned my sanity. But he'd done those things while under the influence of systematic psychological manipulation that had been going on for years. "I missed so many signs," he said as we reached our cars. "The way Elena always knew exactly what to say to make me doubt you. The way she had answers for every question, explanations for every inconsistency. I thought she was helping me understand Dad's wishes, but she was really just teaching me to distrust my own mother. The signs were designed to be missed," I said. "That's what made her so dangerous. She wasn't some obvious villain twirling her mustache. She was a master manipulator who'd spent decades perfecting her techniques. We'd learned during the trial that Robert hadn't been Elena's first victim. She'd been involved in similar schemes targeting elderly relatives, using her knowledge of family dynamics and her technical expertise to systematically defraud people who trusted her. Robert's murder had been an escalation, but not an aberration. "Have you decided what you're going to do with the house?" Michael asked. I'd been thinking about that question for months. The house where Robert and I had built our life together, where we'd raised Michael, where I'd grieved for 6 years. It held too many complicated memories now, but it also held too much love to simply abandon. "I'm going to renovate it," I said. "Turn it into something new while keeping the parts that matter." Mrs. Patterson suggested I might consider opening a support center for people who've been victims of financial fraud or family manipulation. Mrs. Patterson had become more than just a witness to my ordeal. She'd become a friend, a mentor, and an inspiration. At 73, she'd shown courage and clarity that had literally saved my life. Her testimony had been crucial in convicting Elena and David, but more than that, her willingness to believe me when no one else would had given me the strength to keep fighting. "That sounds perfect," Michael said. "Dad would have loved that." We'd been able to talk about Robert more easily in recent months, once the poison of Elena's lies had been cleared away. The private investigators' reports had revealed that Robert had been suspicious of Elena's renewed contact with the family, that he'd hired security because he was worried about her intentions. He'd been trying to protect us when he died, not hiding secrets from us. "There's something else," I said, pulling an envelope from my purse. "The attorney found this among Elena's possessions." She'd kept it all these years. Inside the envelope was a letter Robert had written to me shortly before his death, apparently mailed to Elena's address by mistake, and intercepted before it could be forwarded. In his familiar handwriting, he'd told me about his concerns regarding Elena's sudden reappearance in his life, about the security measures he was taking, and about his plans to update our wills and insurance policies to protect me and Michael. Most importantly, he'd written about his love for me, about his gratitude for the life we'd built together, about his hopes for our future. Reading his words after 6 years of wondering whether our marriage had been as real as I'd believed was like receiving a blessing from beyond the grave. He knew, Michael said after reading the letter. He knew she was dangerous, and he was trying to protect us. He did protect us, I said, by being the kind of man who inspired people like Mrs. Patterson to pay attention, by raising a son who ultimately chose truth over comfortable lies, by loving me enough that I couldn't give up even when everything seemed hopeless. As we prepared to leave the courthouse parking garage, Michael hesitated. Mom, I know I don't have the right to ask this after everything that's happened, but do you think we can rebuild what we had? Do you think you can ever trust me again? I looked at my son, really looked at him, for the first time in months without the shadow of betrayal coloring my perception. I saw Robert's eyes, my own stubborn chin, and something new, humility. The experience had changed him, forced him to confront his own vulnerability and capacity for error. Trust isn't something you rebuild, I said. It's something you build new, stronger than before, with the knowledge of what can go wrong and the commitment to do better. He hugged me then, the first real embrace we'd shared since the truth came out. It felt different from our old relationship, more careful, more intentional, but also more genuine. I love you, Mom. I'm sorry it took almost losing you to remember how to show it. Driving home from the courthouse, I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The grief that had nearly destroyed me, the betrayal that had almost broken me, the lies that had threatened to erase me entirely, but also the strength I'd discovered in myself, the allies I'd found in unexpected places, the truth that had ultimately set us all free. Elena Morrison had tried to steal everything from me, my money, my sanity, my family, my life. But in the end, she'd given me something I'd never had before. Absolute certainty in my own strength and judgment. I'd survived her worst, and I'd emerged not just intact, but transformed. At home, Mrs. Patterson was waiting on my front porch with a bottle of champagne and a smile that could have powered the entire neighborhood. "How did it go?" she asked, though my expression had already given her the answer. "Justice," I said simply. "Complete and total justice." We sat on my porch as the sun set. Two women who'd learned that age didn't mean powerlessness, that isolation wasn't inevitable, that truth was always worth fighting for no matter how impossible the odds seemed. "You know what I learned through all of this?" I said as we watched the street where so much surveillance and deception had taken place. "What's that, dear?" "I learned that sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Sometimes the people others underestimate are exactly the ones who change everything." Mrs. Patterson raised her glass. "To quiet voices and loud truths." "To quiet voices and loud truths," I agreed. And for the first time in 6 years, I felt truly, completely at peace. I'd been tested by grief, betrayal, and systematic cruelty. I'd been isolated, gaslighted, and nearly destroyed by people who underestimated the strength that lies dormant in a woman who has loved deeply and lost profoundly. But I'd survived. More than that, I'd prevailed. I'd learned that sometimes it's the silence that screams loudest of all.